Uh, okay, I'm going to go out of sequence a little bit because I want to make sure I talk about Abraham Lincoln and his character. He just got elected president, okay? He just got elected president. You know, they say, and I'm one of those people too, that agrees that Abraham Lincoln was a great man. But he was a great man because he grew while he was president. He did not, you know, Lincoln today he was a very, very ambitious man. But he also was a man that would probably never, ever get elected president in this day and age. Can you tell me why he would probably never get elected? And you're probably right whenever your opinion is.
Because his looks that he couldn't speak well. I give him a good point out.
Anybody else? Yeah. He was, okay, in my opinion, he wasn't a politician. He had two characteristics that would never get him elected president today. And got him elected in 1860 because people didn't require of him certain things. Two things, although he was a very ambitious man. What was the name that the kids grow up? Honest Abe. You look at a politician today, they're all double talking. You know? The thing that made Abe Lincoln maybe not so great in the beginning and may have helped cause the Civil War is that Abe Lincoln couldn't double talk. He could not carry it off. He felt that what he said is what he meant. And so for a long time, when, you know, he got elected president, nobody asked him what's going to happen to. You remember the country was in a state of somnolence. The country was in a state of somnolence. They didn't want to anticipate that there would be a secession. He was never asked that question. And he in his own mind never thought that even though there was talk of secession, never believed that there would be a secession. Never really believed it. Because first of all, it wasn't brought up to his attention. And people have a tendency, and this is another thing, although he was honest, if he didn't have anything to say, he'd get up in front of a crowd that was there would be people coming from miles around. It was a big celebration to see Abe Lincoln. And if he didn't have anything to say, he'd get up in front of the audience and say, I have nothing to say. And they would all cheer him anyway because they were looking for a leader. But he was the guy that said, I have nothing. He would not placate a crowd. And a lot of times he said, I don't know what I really... And so when he got elected president, he made a campaign. He left his hometown of Springfield. And he traveled to Washington, and he got out every night, and he had to see the railroad. And everybody was coming to see him on the inauguration trail. He made some stupid things. He said some stupid things. He was experimenting with his words. He meant what he said. He always meant what he said. But he didn't know what was going to happen. He grew into it. I said he was a great president because he grew into it. But he would get up and people would say, what did he say? He said he said things like the states are in the state of, if you get married to somebody, and maybe the South is thinking of leaving, but there's no adultery. You know, I mean, he would say things that he was thinking in his own mind, he'd think out loud. And he realized, and he didn't want to do that. So what happened, from the time he got elected in November, to the time he got elected in November, to the time he became president, assumed the presidency, he didn't say anything. He said, and you know what he said when he said, why aren't you clarifying it? Can't you get these states? Remember, they were attempting to leave the Union. Buchanan, always give Buchanan credit. Give Buchanan credit. I did that, I said that last week. Buchanan never cut the cord. They tried to cut the cord, those 6 states. But Buchanan said they're not out of the Union. I don't agree to it. He wouldn't fight, but he wouldn't make it official. So basically he was leaving it up to events. But Lincoln, during that period of time, would say, even when they were doing that, and he says, well, man, when I get elected, things will be working out all right. I'll carry that. I'll worry about it when I become president. Now, if you want to be a great man, a great leader, if he was a great confident, he would get up. He would meet with Buchanan. They would work together to save the Union. They would say, I'm the president to be. Let's work together. But Buchanan and Lincoln didn't talk to one another because Lincoln said, let Buchanan run the show. And Lincoln also didn't know what he was going to do. He did know. He did state, though, and he told Buchanan this, if they leave the Union, I'm bringing them back. And that was but they always said to Lincoln during this time, he says, I've said, if and when they said, Mr. Lincoln, can't you, remember, he got elected on the clear statement that he did not believe in the extension of slavery, because slavery was morally wrong. Slavery was morally wrong, but he will accept it where it is. He never started this war to end slavery. Over and over again, it was to bring back the states that said that they had left the Union, and he said they never did. But when they asked him, Mr. Lincoln, why don't you, the Senate, the House, separately, each one, trying to save the Union while Buchanan was still president? And they basically came to Lincoln, and they came to Buchanan, and they said separately, and they said to them separately, if you have a referendum in the United States, and you extend slavery similar to the 1820 Compromise, anything north of 3630, free as you go west in the territories. Anything south of 3630, slave. That's what they did before. That's what they did before. Lincoln told these people that we said, let's have a referendum on it. And you know what? Probably the referendum would have passed. The country would have accepted that. The country probably would have, definitely to avoid war, would have accepted that slavery should be extended 3630 north. They should be free, and that below it should be slave. But Lincoln had said in his electoral statement, I say what I mean, and I mean what I say. I got elected on the assumption. And I said that slavery is morally wrong and we can't extend it anywhere. So Lincoln was asked by people in the border slave states. They said, maybe we'll come back to the Union. Give us an opportunity. Give us a piece. Give us a piece of bread. Give us, like the dog. Give me a bone. He said, I'm not giving anybody a bone. I got elected on a statement that I made, and I owe it to the people who elected me. I can't go back on the word of the people who elected me, although the South didn't vote for him, because they didn't put him on the ballot. I can't go back on the fact that I'm a constitutionally elected president. I got the majority electoral vote, and I made the statement over and over again in the campaign that I do not believe in the extension of slavery, period. I can't change my position simply because now the South is now. I don't have to pay what do you call it, I don't owe an apology for being elected president and change my position. So he basically said, don't ask me for a clarification. I've said it. I'm clear enough. I always speak straight. Now, maybe if he wasn't such a great man, a great person as a person, he would have obfuscated. He would have confused. He would have maybe saved the country from a war. But he was honest, Abe. And he also had a second. Remember I said there were two characteristics that made him maybe not a great man, well, it did. He had something similar to Richard Nixon. Just the opposite. Richard Nixon, in my opinion, was not a genuine man. I mean, you don't have to agree with me. There are a lot of, but Nixon had problems. So did Lincoln. But Nixon's problem and Wilson's problem, Woodrow Wilson's problem, and Lincoln's problem is that they had a very low view of human nature. You say, this great man Lincoln, how could he have a low view of human nature? Oh, yeah. A low view of human nature. Lincoln did never believe. In other words, Lincoln had a sense of tragedy about him. Lincoln had a depression. So did Nixon. So did Wilson. You know, Woodrow Wilson, which I talk about, he had this image, and Lincoln had this, and Nixon had this image. That is, even if 55% of the people like you, what about the others? You know, Nixon with his cover-up. He had a pure win, but he was always looking for enemies. Now, Lincoln wasn't looking for enemies. Lincoln was just the opposite. Lincoln had considered everybody who could be an enemy a friend. But Lincoln had the same depression that Nixon had, even extreme. Lincoln was an extremely, he would never be elected president. You know, maybe Jimmy Carter, you remember he had that Malay about him, that the country, and maybe he was right, Jimmy Carter, when he said we have to worry about the Malay, that we have to, he put on his sweat, he said we all got to get off oil, but he all made it appear. Well, that was Lincoln. It was just the opposite of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, I don't think Ronald Reagan ever had a bad day in his life. Ronald Reagan was happy every minute of the day. Abe Lincoln was depressed every minute of the day. Abe Lincoln was depressed every minute of the day. Richard Nixon was depressed, and and he had the suspicion about people. But Lincoln, Wilson, he said, when everybody's cheering me now, I'm waiting for the cheering to stop. You know? Strange men made presidents. Had Lincoln run, he would have been thrown out. The guy who's depressed all the time would never get elected president of the United States. Lincoln had a very low view of human nature. He felt that people would never go out and fight a war for a principle, even if the principle was slavery. They wouldn't. Lincoln got ahead in large part because he believed that I can't expect much from people. But he always looked at people as a friend. But he expected disappointment. So basically Lincoln was very strong. Because when people disillusioned him, he was already expecting it to be disillusioned. So in many ways, you could say that's a good quality. But Lincoln's belief that people would not fight a war over a principle was one of the reasons why he didn't worry until he got elected president what the South would do. He was so involved with getting his cabinet together and trying to get a Southerner in his cabinet, maybe to make it, you know, to maybe appease the South. Or he tried very hard to get a Southerner, he couldn't get one. Point is that Lincoln was a man who had a low view of human nature, and I don't think he would have gone very far. And in a way, it was good. In a way, it was bad for the country. But you got to remember, in 1860, Lincoln didn't look like an old man. He looked like a young rail splitter. He was a very strong man. He didn't have that beard. He grew the beard after, you know, during that. I mean, the 4 years that Lincoln was president were, you know, he had to live every day with a wife who was very depressed. He lost 2 children from disease. One of them while he was president. His wife was very depressed over that, and he loved his wife very much. The other thing about Lincoln and others like Wilson, he was a very religious man who kept solace. He really believed that God was calling him. He really believed that his dreams, the outcome of his dreams would affect and he issued the Emancipation Proclamation because he got a dream. When he did, he got a dream. He dreamt that the day before he died, that he was going to die. You know, he dreamt the night before, and he told people that I saw for the first time my gravestone in my dream. And that happened the day he got shot. I'm just saying, he always talked about his dreams to people. Now that's off what I was going, but I wanted to bring it up now for the reason I may not get it across, and this is happening now. He's just got elected president. Remember, as soon as he got elected president, he went to bed. He didn't even tell his wife. You know, he was not the guy that he was elated over things. He said, what a responsibility I got. You know, he was just one of these guys that always felt the burden of responsibility. There were presidents like that too. John Quincy Adams was a lot like that. The trouble with John Quincy Adams is that he was a very conscientious man, and I talk about him, but he never did anything when he was president. Whereas Lincoln did just the opposite. He felt he had to lead the country. And you remember I told you about Buchanan, how he led by committee and he had a split down the middle, and therefore he couldn't get anything done? Well, Lincoln had another quality about him that was great. He had a low opinion of human nature. He also had an opinion that if you're president, you take the responsibility. No one else but you. And single-handedly, he went into war because his whole cabinet, even though they had said during the campaign we should go to war if we have to, his whole cabinet backed down. He refused. He said, I'm a majority of one. My whole cabinet's against me. We're firing on Fort Sumter. We're going to war. I don't care if anybody, I was elected, and not that he had this feeling that he was better than anybody else, he just felt that he had the responsibility. Somebody has to take responsibility. And yes, if 6 people in or 7 people in his cabinet all said no, he said, what about the hundreds of thousands of people out there that are saying, that aren't being spoken to, who say yes? And I got elected, and I said I would bring them back, and I'm going to bring them back. So if you talk about the Civil War, you have to talk about the fact that it was Lincoln's war. It was Lincoln's war. One man. He changed the course of history. Being there at that time, he changed the course. He didn't go, he basically, he was never really leading in front. like Andrew Jackson did. He was basically sensing the tidal wave that was coming underneath him, and he led the tile. In other words, slavery was 5 years ago. Everybody was for not everybody, but the establishment was for slavery, including Lincoln. He never let out front. But when things started to shift, he felt the toe, and he went where he thought history should be, where history would judge him. That's what makes him, in many ways, a great man, because he got the tug of what would be my position 100 years from now. Can't think about what's going to happen today. He never anticipated it when he ran in 1864 he'd get reelected. He expected to lose, and everybody expected him to lose until 4 or 5 months because of Sherman taking Atlanta. Everything changed, and he got reelected. He had prepared for his his leave. Okay, now I bring this up now for a reason, because now we have Lincoln in the background, but he's in the foreground, he's in the background. Lincoln wanted to stay in the background until he became president. I'll worry about that when I get there. Okay, let's go back to where I was when I think I ended it. You remember the Star of the West, what I talked about last week, and about the fact that they hightailed it back out of there before they got, and that Robert Anderson did not protect the ship because he didn't know where the ship was coming from. It could have been planted there by the South to start a war, in his mind, because he got a telegram. He was supposed to get a telegram that he never got. Telegram said, Star of the West is coming to give you food and give you guns. Now, he had just gotten a temporary bread. He had gotten bread and a few other items from the South. They did, remember when I told you that he went across to Fort Sumter? The South went up in arms. Well, what they did is they captured every other fort around them. They encircled the forts. The South did. Fort Moultrie, Fort. And one of the things they did is they said, we're going to send a delegation and declare that Sumter should be surrendered. But we'll give you temporarily bread and food. So Anderson wasn't in desperate need, but he was told, basically, he was told, it ain't going to continue. You're not going to get food forever. And you better not, and we don't expect, in other words, why was he given? He was given food because they were hoping to placate Buchanan and say, look, we didn't starve these people out. When Buchanan refused to meet with the representatives of South Carolina, Anderson had already gotten his food for at least a couple more weeks. And Anderson was not the type of guy that wanted to start a war. And he says, I got my food. Maybe in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, they'll give me food again. So when the Star of the West, which was the beginning of January 3rd, it went out. It came to Fort Sumter, the night of January 8th, the morning of January 9th, around 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning on January 9th. And the guns, got to remember, the South knew. The South had its traders up in Washington, D.C. Anderson didn't have he couldn't get he was intercepted. He didn't know the Star of the West was there to reinforce him. 2 or 3 days before that, because he telegraphed Lincoln. He didn't know the Star of the West had left New York on January 3rd and was going, and then the USS Brooklyn, was following him from Virginia. But both of them, in other words, Brooklyn was a ship that had guns. The Star of the West was a merchant ship. It didn't have any guns. It just had food. It had 150 or 200 troops on it to give them guns, but basically to give them food. Anderson telegrams the president and the Secretary of War and says, don't! Ship of the Star of the West had left. It was like January 4th. It was on its way. The Star of the West doesn't have a telegram either. Doesn't have a telegram. Star of the West doesn't know. Star of the West was told that Sumter will fight back. They didn't even know the Brooklyn was going to follow them. But they did. Brooklyn never caught up with the Star of the West from Virginia. Anderson telegraphed Washington, don't say help me now. You help me now, start a war. Don't help me. I have enough food. I'm not starving right now. They got it, Washington. As soon as they got it, they wanted to tell it. They couldn't get hold of Anderson. Never got to Anderson. Meanwhile, the South, Southern people, people in the Southern, Trescott, few people that were working, sent a telegram to the governor of South Carolina, Francis Pickens. It looks like there's a ship coming down. We don't know, but we think it's the Brooklyn. We don't know. There's movement coming down there. Be ready to fire. The only one that didn't know what was going on was the Star of the West that was going down there. Unarmed, expecting help, and Anderson. In fact, a newspaper came in on January 7th, and Anderson got the paper, and it said in there, the paper, the South Carolina paper, said, it looks like they're arming Fort Sumter. They're giving aid. The ship was coming a day later. Anderson said, this is all hocus pocus. If they really want to go to help me, I would have gotten a telegram. So everybody had the South even had the newspapers. Everybody in Charleston knew that was going, except Anderson and his troops. I mean, it's crazy. It's, to me, absolutely crazy. The Star of the West comes up from the north. I don't have the diagram, but you had it from last week. And these kids from the Citadel on Morris Island, where the Citadel is, 17-year-old kids, fire, start the war. Start the Civil War. They fire guns at this unarmed ship. One of them hits the ship. One of them hits waves. Star of the West can't fire back, doesn't have guns. Then all of a sudden, maybe 2 minutes later, he's circling around trying to get into Sumter, and the guns from Fort Moultrie are firing from the other end. One's firing from the south, where Citadel's. In other words, the reason they didn't go, the Star of the West went around that way, was to avoid the Moultrie. They didn't know that there were kids at the Citadel that were going to fight guns at them. They fired guns, one hit the ship. Then all of a sudden, guns from Fort Moultrie are trying to position themselves, crossfire. Star of the West is expecting what they were told would happen. Anderson would protect them by firing his guns and giving him a safe haven to get into Fort Sumter. And I told you, what happened is that Foster and Doubleday are on the parapet at Fort Sumter. And they said, they're firing at the ship. You got to do something, Anderson. Anderson says, I can't start a civil war. I don't know who they are. If he had gotten a telegram, the war would have started right then and there. Because the one thing that was happening was that Buchanan, at that moment in January, had a cabinet that had shifted. Because there was an honor about the Southern cabinet members in Buchanan's cabinet. Cass resigned. He said, Lewis Cass, the Secretary of Treasury, said, I'm sorry, not Lewis Cass, Howell Cobb, forgive me. Howell Cobb, the Secretary of Treasury, said, he was a Secretary of Treasury from Georgia. He said, I can't stay in this administration. I can't represent you, Mr. Buchanan, because I'm with the South. And he resigned. Cobb resigned. And I told you what happened to Floyd, the Secretary of War. He was thrown out. because he had committed a fraud. He had taken money from trust funds that were supposed to go to the Indians, and he had given it to the war supplier out west to keep them going. So Floyd was thrown out as Secretary of War, and Howard Cobb was resigned as Secretary of Treasury. So no longer was it 3-3, because what happened was the Postmaster General Holt, Joseph Holt, ended up as Secretary of State. He was on the northern side. He ended up as Secretary of State. Cassett resigned, and there was now an opening in the Treasury. And later, you ever hear Fort Dix? John Dix became Secretary of War. Northerner. And the man that was Jeremiah Black, who was Attorney General, moved up. He eventually became Secretary of State. Jeremiah Black was the Attorney General, became Secretary of State. He was a Northerner. Who took his place as Attorney General? Edwin Stanton. And on the first day in office, December 27, 1860, he called Buchanan a traitor. He called the president that just appointed him Secretary of Treasury, Attorney General. He says, I'm going to be Attorney General, but if you do this, you're a traitor. I mean, I got to tell you, before I go into 1861, 1860 was some crazy year. How many people could say, and also the head of the Army, Winfield Scott, who was in New York all this time because he couldn't talk to Buchanan, suddenly came back, and what did he do? Instead of talking to Buchanan, because he didn't think Buchanan would do anything, Winfield Scott calls Lincoln and says, you've been elected president. Now here's the head of the Army. You think he'd be talking to the president? He's talking to the president-elect, who's not going to be president until 3 or 4 months. And he tells Abe Lincoln, what are you going to do? And Lincoln tells him, Lincoln tells him privately, I'm only a citizen. You're the head of the Army. You're the head of the United States Army. You're the Lieutenant General of the United States Army. I know that Buchanan's not talking to you, but now that you're coming back to Washington, I'm letting you know that I'm going to bring back the South. So Scott then devises the scheme about the Star North. So you have this crazy thing about 1860. What a crazy year it was. All because of what happened basically starting in 1859 with the John Brown's raid, John Brown's hanging, beginning of 1860 to the end of 1860. You can't ever tell me, you can't find a year where you had traitors in the cabinet. You had the Secretary of War trying to destroy the Union. You had Assistant Secretary of State Tresca trying to destroy it. You have Winfield Scott talking to Lincoln. You have these, instead of to the president, you have a crazy situation, and you have the whole country who elected a man and they didn't know they were going to war, but they knew. But the South had. It was 1860. Itself was a very strange year in the presidency of the United States. So now, war is averted because Anderson doesn't fight back. But then he talks to the governor and says, did you really intend to fight back on me? If you did, I'm closing the port. So what does Pickens do, the governor of South Carolina? He says, I did intend to fire on you. I did intend to fire on you. But don't close the port, because if you do that, there'll be a war. So sure enough, Anderson, who felt he had to back, now that he backed down by not firing on the Star of the West, was going to threaten to close the port, says, let's send emissaries to Washington. And Anderson sends a lieutenant, the lowest company officer, Norman Hill, and he accompanies on the trip to Washington the emissary from South Carolina named Hayne. And Hayne goes up with Hill. Hill gives the northern point of view. And meanwhile, they don't fight. Meanwhile, the port's still open. But what does that mean? It means by not fighting, the South the North can't get its guns. It was stopped. But who can get stronger? Can the North get stronger? Can something get stronger? No. But who can get stronger around it? The South. And remember, Jefferson Davis had told the governor of South Carolina, don't start a war yet, we're going to join you in about a month. So he was buying time for the South to get stronger and stronger, to get the guns at the Citadel that could really hit the next boats, to get the guns at Moultrie to hit. But meanwhile, Hayne went up, met with the Buchanan, and he says, I talked to this man who was the President of the United States, this lieutenant. He says, I was talking to a dish rag. The guy didn't know what it was. Yeah. I mean, Buchanan was really a very weak man. And Hayne, but one thing Buchanan did, because he had his cabinet supporting him, Buchanan said to the Hayne, who was the Southerner, I refuse to meet with you. You committed an illegal act by firing on the Star of the West. It's one thing to say you're leaving the Union. It's another thing to take over a fort, because that's tangible. I can't see when you leave a Union. In other words, the country was not concerned so much about that Alabama and Mississippi and these other states were leaving the Union, because after all, Buchanan hadn't accepted it. It was not tangible. What was tangible is that they shot guns at the Star of the West. And what was tangible right now was what's going to happen to Fort Sumter. The whole country was not worried about whether the South should leave the Union, because after all, it had never really left. It was, will we be able to protect this fort? Even though Anderson didn't want any food right now, he was going to eventually starve out. Buchanan refused to meet with Hayne. Hayne in a huff said, what kind of a president are you that you won't meet with I'm the president, I've been sent by the president of South Carolina, which is a separate country, and you have put a fort between our ships and our town. How dare you put a fort that had been there for 60 years. How dare you have a fort telling us we can't, that our ships have to go through the port to go past your fort, to get to Charleston. How dare you, Mr. President? And Hayne was right. Buchanan finally got his courage up and says, I refuse to meet with him. This is crazy. This is crazy. Because now he had the cabinet behind him. One way. Okay. Jefferson Davis was the senator of Mississippi, January 21. Congress is meeting. Jefferson Davis says, I'm going to say goodbye. He's the senator of Mississippi. He's leaving the Union. Jefferson Davis goes, addresses the Senate. And all the Southerners that were, I'm not talking about South Carolina, they were after Union. He gets up. Davis, it says, the time has come for me to say goodbye. All you people who I've met, I've been here for a long time, I have no enemies with you. But my state, it is time, I believe that the South cannot be represented in this country anymore, because we have a president to be, this is January 21 before Lincoln's president, that has said slavery is morally wrong. And I refuse to, but even if, this is interesting, because what he said, what was going on in the states down there, Mississippi, Alabama, he was talking for his state, he was talking about himself, he was talking about the people down there. He said, even if I didn't believe we had a right to leave the Union, I have to go along with what my state says. My state says I must leave the Union, and I'm a representative of my state, and I have to leave the Union even if I don't agree with it. But I do agree with it. But if I didn't, I still would have to agree with it. And he leaves and says, I now bid you adieu. Very tired man. Doesn't expect to be, he expects to become the military head of Mississippi, the state of Mississippi. On January 9th, the day that the Star of West was fired upon, Mississippi leaves the Union. Second state. Followed by Florida on January 10th. followed by Alabama on January 11th, followed by then Louisiana and Georgia. That's 6 states. South Carolina already out. I named 5 others. 6 states. Texas says we're going to hold a vote on February 1. But right now, when Davis is addressing the Senate on January 21, 6 states are out of the Union. Not out of the Union. 6 states have said they're out of the Union. 6 states have said they're out of the Union. That's why Jefferson Davis still addressed the Senate, because he was still a representative, because the North had not said you're out of the Union. He went back to Mississippi. And while he's going back, he tells the governor of South Carolina, Francis Pickens, we don't want you to fire on this fort. We want to form a confederacy. We've left the Union. Let us join you in firing on Fort Sumter, or getting Fort Sumter. And hopefully there will be an avoidance of war. Now, one thing about Jefferson Davis, and also he knew in his back of his mind, even though Lincoln didn't, in the back of his mind, he told people, when everybody said to him, if you read the book On with the Wind and all these other books, they were saying, well, the war will last only a week or 2. There won't be a war. Lincoln won't go to war. When Lincoln becomes president, it won't happen. Davis said, I know Lincoln. I know the man. We're going to go for a war. Thousands upon thousands of people will die as a result of us leaving the Union. But he said, I'm hoping it doesn't happen. I said, I can't make for sure, and I hope we can leave peacefully. And he dreamt he went home and said, he like Lincoln when he got elected, when Davis left the Union, he said, I'm leaving the Union. At least Davis knew it was going to be blood shed. He didn't know. He said to everybody, blood's going to be shed. A lot of blood. He goes back, and he expects to become a military man with his blood being shed. And he tells Pickens, wait, we're holding a convention of the 6 states that have left the Union. I told you, South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Florida. I think I gave him 6. The first 6 up there. Anyway, they meet in Montgomery, Alabama, which a town that is only 40 years old, a town that is new, and I think it's the capital of Alabama then, but now they meet. 35 or 36 men meet in Montgomery, Alabama. Davis goes back to he expects to be a military, so he doesn't to join it. The president of this 35, 36 man group that is meeting to form a new country is Howell Cobb from Georgia. And everybody suspects that the president of the Confederacy, if they form one, the president's going to be Howell Cobb of Georgia. They meet in Montgomery on February 4th. They have to write a constitution, even though it's not a complete constitution, at least a what do they call it, a first constitution, a draft, a constitution to keep work, and then have a Congress, and they decide on a unicameral Congress, and that they will then elect a president. And he's got to be elected in closed vote, because they don't want to show any dissension, so everything is closed. These 35 men meet, closed session, no one knows what's really going on. But 3 states have committed themselves to Cobb to become president. And these are very sober-minded men, old men, all of them old. All of them making it appear that they're doing not doing a revolutionary act by leaving the Union, but just the opposite. That the revolutionary act was done by the North. in doing proposals where the South couldn't be represented, and that they were the traditional constitution of the United States. The South was creating now a new constitution, but basically it was an old constitution because the North had trespassed from its own constitution, and they don't really belong in the Union anymore. We are the Constitution. They are the new one. They were sober-minded men. None of them had fire in their bones, but they all believed that they were leaving the Union, and they're going to do it very, very somberly. What a shame the North has left the Union. We're the true Union. They left the Union because they left their principles behind them, that form the country. But they changed the Constitution. In the Constitution, they mentioned slavery as a right. They want to make sure, because it wasn't in the U.S. Constitution that slavery was right, although they had mentioned slavery. But now they specifically say slavery is right. The interesting thing is that they also do one other thing that you wouldn't expect. They continue to prohibit the importation. It prohibit the importation of slaves. The Constitution had prohibited the importation of slaves after 20 years, when they wrote it in 1787. They said until the South actually wrote in its Constitution that we shall not import slaves from Africa. We got enough slaves as it is, down south. We don't need any. We're doing fine. We don't have to import slaves. But we do believe slavery is right, and we do believe that slavery should be wherever anybody wants is going, out west, if they want to go out west. This was done on February 4th to February 8th. They also said, this is very interesting to me, they said nothing about secession. Why do you think they said nothing about secession? In other words, once we form a confederation, they didn't say you had a right to secede or not to secede. Does anybody have an idea why they left that out? They had an argument over this.
Revenge of the war?
They always felt. You remember in the Constitution of the United States, there's nothing about whether you can secede or not. There's nothing in this Constitution in 1787 that says you can secede or not secede. They said it's an inbuilt right. It's so evident that we don't have to say it. You got it? And why did they do that? Because if they said they had to put it in writing, the argument could be made that they didn't have a right to secede because it wasn't in writing in the other one. You got it? In other words, if they said you can secede, if a state can secede, and they all basically believed the states can secede. They all believed that they were a confederation and they could leave, but we're not going to put it in, because if we put it in, we're making an admission that since the other one didn't have it, that we didn't have a right to do it in the first place. Does everybody see the argument? So as a result, they didn't say it because they wanted to say it's so obvious, and that's why we left the Union too. We left the U.S. too. So it's and they also they said, now let's elect the president. And they did it behind closed doors. And they looked around, they said, Howell Cobb, well, he was in Buchanan's administration. And he worked for the United States. He worked for the United States because he was in the cabinet as Secretary of Treasury. And although they said he was a great Secretary of Treasury because he didn't leave the U.S. with any money, he was such a great treasury that he didn't leave any money. He left the U.S. weak. But we don't want him because he's too close to Buchanan, who's still the President of the United States. And we don't want to. So there was a movement. And you remember, they wanted a unanimous vote. There was a movement. And to stop Cobb, they didn't think of Davis. But they had to stop him. And the only way in other words, this was not a pro-Davis group, but they were an anti-Cobb group, 50-50. And they wanted a union. So they said, who can we go to that has stature? And they couldn't go to Yancey. Remember I told you William Landis Yancey? He was too radical. He's the one that got him basically started and getting him out of the Union. And you could say that William Landis Yancey was the type of guy that caused it all, because he had organized all these people to get out. Yancey was too radical. Cobb is to conciliatory, where we don't have a pro-Davis thing, but we're going to make him president. And we're going to do it unanimously. So Howard Cobb, oh, this is interesting. Howard Cobb was, the people of Georgia who wanted Howard Cobb said they didn't really know that Davis was the, they said, well, we can't have Cobb, let's get Robert Toombs, another radical. Robert Toombs expected to get it, but he says, I only wanted this unanimous. When Toombs went up against Davis, and Toombs saw that Davis and he were going to be deadlocked, Toombs withdrew. And Davis, who wasn't even there, didn't even expect it, was not in touch with anybody, became president while he was working on his plantation in Pryville. February 14th, he gets the word. February 13th, he gets word that he's the president of the Confederacy. He's very reluctant about it. His wife gives him the news. He actually almost collapses that he's going to be the president of the Confederacy. What happens then is that, oh, I wanted to now tell you that why didn't these other states leave the Union? Because they all believed Texas was the one state that was going to have its convention, but Virginia, Mississippi, Florida, Virginia, Arkansas, Missouri, Tennessee, North Carolina, Maryland, Delaware, Arkansas didn't leave the Union because they felt that the election of President Lincoln was not enough to cause a secession. Another point I want to make is that Virginia might not have eventually left the Union, but for one fact, Virginia had been the home of John Brown's raid. Virginia might have been like Kentucky and Delaware and Maryland and Missouri, stay in the Union. But because of John Brown's raid, they decided to leave. To wait to see what Lincoln would do. But I wanted to bring up, there was this schism. A lot of the people in the South, including Mississippi, I told you these states that left the Union, they did what Davis did. They said, I consider myself a traitor. But I consider it, not myself, I consider it to be a traitorous act to leave the Union. I love the Union. But I love my state more. Okay? So that is basically why these states supported South Carolina, because although they didn't hate the Union, they felt that they had to go along with their state. And the one thing I have to tell you is that, I should tell you is, how much time do I have? 1 minute. Is that the Constitution that was formed in the South by Davis, it was basically anti-democratic. It said so. It said we don't believe in mobs. And the North has basically had mobs running their states. They were an oligopoly of special men and figured they could lead the Southern white poor man and woman will follow them, because the one thing they believed in was race discrimination. You see, the South had all the blacks. There wasn't transportation to go to California next week. The North didn't have blacks. They all were thrown in. There were free blacks, but there weren't that many. The North didn't fight over slavery because it didn't know blacks. Who knew the blacks? The South. And the poor people of the South, the poor white person of the South, whether we like it or not, they felt that there was somebody they could step on. Because they were all around them, these blacks, but they were slaves. And we could step on them. And they basically in the South said, we're living with the blacks. You're not living with the blacks. Lincoln himself, I told you at that time, said we'll ship them all back to Africa. He didn't have any dealings with the blacks. You see people that were fighting in the Civil War. I saw a black man for the first time. If you read that book, Shiraz's book, the soldiers from Massachusetts, there were few of them were fighting for the rights of man, but most of them didn't know blacks. It was all an abstraction to them. But down south it was reality. But the reality, the whole way of life of the South, the whole way of life of the Southern way of life, was that there was a black man to kick around. And that is basically what the poor person, they didn't have to proclaim we're for democracy in the South. They knew that the Southern person would fight a war even to keep their Southern way of life. Because the poor white man was basically a happy man. The poor white man was basically a happy man. Because he had a black man to kick around, and he was getting his food from his farm. And although he didn't have slaves, he liked the Southern way of life. And the people up north, they're from a hostile country. They're from a hostile way of life. It was a fight over the way of life. Southern way of life, non-Southern way of life. People that are black, that are living in the South, people that aren't black, people that are no blacks, and this is basically why the South joined up again and united. Even though they may have liked the Union, they love their way of life more in the South. Okay, any questions?